Welcome back to class 7th and 8th grade. Hopefully you guys did well on the test. I will be sending you your essay grade shortly. You should have already seen your multiple choice grades. Of course, I will go through those and double check that my answers were correct. Therefore, you got a correct grade. If you have any questions on that, please feel free to email me. Perhaps you already have. And this is just old news, but just in case it isn't, if you had a question you think perhaps Mr. Mortar put the answer in wrong on Google Forms, just shoot me an email and I'll take care of that for you and take a look at those. So those will be out shortly. Today we're going to be talking about the Punic Wars. Actually, we're going to spend this entire week talking about the Punic Wars. You probably will have met with me via Zoom by the point that you're watching this, unless you are extraordinarily forward working. Maybe you're watching this before we have talked together. But we're going to be talking about the Punic Wars. The Punic Wars are the most important conflict in early Roman history, and they're really when Rome establishes itself as the most powerful nation in the Mediterranean. It's what puts Rome on the path to dominating all of its neighbors, including the Greeks, who we have been talking about for the last really month. We've been talking about the Greeks and their civilization. The Romans are going to conquer them, and they have the resources to do that because they win the Punic Wars. And really, the winner of the Punic Wars, one way or the other, was probably going to dominate the Mediterranean Sea, because the other party, the other group that fights in the Punic Wars are the Carthaginians, another immensely powerful nation that really spent a lot of time fighting and growing and really had what was necessary to conquer others. Unfortunately for them, they ran into the Romans, and the Romans ended up beating them. So either way you slice it, the winner of the Punic Wars was probably going to go on to dominate the rest of the world, and it just so happens that the Romans won. And we'll talk about why they won. It wasn't coincidence that they won or luck, but there are some important things that we need to understand from this. Now, to catch you back up to where we are from a Roman history perspective, and by the way, I will be posting a PDF of my slides that you would normally see in class on our class page, so those will be available to look at if you would like. To refresh you on where we are, Rome has conquered Italy. All right, it's been fighting in Italy now for approximately 300 years. It threw off its king, remember, Superbus, the best, not so good, right? They threw him off in approximately the 500s BC. And since the 500s BC, the Romans have had a republic. We talked about the offices of the republic, the consuls, the praetors, the aediles, the quaestors. We talked about the two classes of Romans, the patricians, the plebeians. We talked about the tribunes with the veto power, right? We talked about all that last week. But while that's going on politically, Rome militaristically is conquering its neighbors. People like the Samnites, people like the Latins, people all over Italy. And in fact, if you're looking at the PDF, you can see a map of all different colors representing different times that the Romans conquered different people. Now, this was not without setbacks. We talked about in 390 BC, the city of Rome is destroyed or sacked by the Gauls, and it has to be rebuilt. All right, so Rome hasn't won a pure string of victories, but they are slowly conquering Italy. And there's really only one section of Italy, or what we might call Italy today, that was not under Roman control, and that was the large island off the west coast of Italy, and that is the island of Sicily. And if Sicily is a boot, then Sicily is the soccer ball being kicked by that boot. And again, if you've got the map there, you'll be able to see that. Now, Sicily is an interesting place. It was colonized by the Greeks a long time before the Romans show up, probably in the 600s or 500s BC. We're not entirely clear when it was colonized, but you'll remember that the city of Sicily, or the island of Sicily, played an important role in the war between Athens and Sparta. Remember that Athens had sent that huge fleet to go conquer the island of Sicily, and they had failed spectacularly. Remember that character Alcibiades had talked the Athenians into going here, and the Athenians had gone, and Alcibiades had jumped ship, and then the Athenians lost, and this eventually leads to them losing the entire war. So we've already talked about Sicily. And so Sicily has been colonized by Greeks. It's got Greek speakers that live there, Greek cities that live there, but really the Greeks are not in control of the island. There's one important city on the island. It's the city of Syracuse that speaks Greek, is effectively a Greek city transported out of Greece and dropped into Sicily. But the rest of the island is not under Greek control. And it's actually under the control of an empire that has been rising, that's been causing problems. It's not Rome. It's, in fact, Carthage. Now, Carthage is an interesting place. Carthage goes back a long time. In fact, it was colonized or settled probably sometime in the 800s BC. We're not exactly clear on when it was settled, but we know at some point in the 800s, Carthage was established. It was actually established by the Phoenicians, who, of course, we've already talked about. They're most famous for their alphabet. And in fact, our initial studying of language as elementary school kids still bears the Phoenicians' names, right? You guys remember taking phonics in elementary school, probably in first, second, maybe third grade. You were taking phonics. This relates back to the Phoenicians. So the Phoenicians actually lived in cities near Israel. In fact, the cities of Tyre and Sidon, just north of Israel, is where the Phoenicians lived. They leave that area and they sail along the north coast of Africa. And at the point of Africa that sticks up the furthest, if you get out a map of Africa, if you Google a map of Africa right now and you look at the furthest northern point of Africa, that's where Carthage was. Okay, it kind of sticks up into the Mediterranean. I can see a map on my wall right here. It sticks up into the Mediterranean. That's where Carthage is. Now, these Carthaginians, or Phoenicians as they were originally, found the city Carthage, but eventually the cities of Tyre and Sidon, while they're important, get less important than the city of Carthage itself. Carthage is in a perfect location. I know we think of Africa as either like jungles, lions, or desert, right? Those are like the only three things that we think exist in Africa. That's not the truth. In fact, North Africa is actually from a climate perspective, it's very nice. It's like the rest of the Mediterranean, right? You've got olive trees growing there, grape trees, or grape bushes. You've got agriculture, you've got water. It's not the desert or anything like that. So Carthage is wealthy because of what's around it. It's also situated in a good place for trade. If you want to ship things from Spain to Israel, for example, which perhaps was what people were doing when Jonah gets on the boat and he's trying to run to Tarsus. Tarsus was probably in Spain, so he may have, if he hadn't gotten eaten by the whale, he may have actually stopped by Carthage on the way out there, especially based on the time that this was occurring. That certainly would have been a possibility. So Carthage was in a perfect location. If you were shipping goods across the Mediterranean and you wanted to take a stop, which you probably did, otherwise your boat would sink, it would be the perfect spot to stop. And so Carthage gets very wealthy. It actually eclipses or grows more important than Tyre and Sidon even. And so many people don't realize that the Carthaginians were actually Phoenicians. Now, by the way, just from a biblical perspective, so you're aware, the Phoenicians really have another name in the Bible, and that name would be the Canaanites. So the Carthaginians were actually descended from the Canaanites, the people who originally inhabited the land of Israel before the Israelites moved in. And that means, by the way, that they brought some religious practices with them that the Bible really rejects. So when we're studying the Carthaginians, it's important to keep in mind that these guys are the Canaanites in reality. They did some really gross things like sacrificing children to their gods Baal and Moloch, who you may have heard about in the Bible. So the Carthaginians do have some issues, and I think despite the fact that the Roman gods certainly have their own host of issues, they're a lot better. Roman religious practices are a lot better than what the Carthaginians were doing. But the Carthaginians are powerful, they're wealthy, and they really invest heavily in their navy. And this makes sense. If we look at where Carthage is, if you look on the map at where Carthage is, if Carthage wants to affect other places, it has to go over water, right? There's no way to walk from Carthage to really anywhere other than Africa, which Carthage already controlled. So if you're going to get from Carthage to anywhere else, you need to build ships and have a navy. And if you look at where Carthage is, that northernmost point of Africa, if you look directly over, you see Sicily. And it was Carthage that was in Sicily, that was struggling over Sicily with the local cities. And in fact, a figure that we already talked about, Pyrrhus of Epirus, that guy who had come over and he'd fought Rome to a standstill, and he turned to his lieutenants and he said, if we win one more battle against the Romans while losing so many men, it's like we are going to lose, right? He lost so many men fighting the Romans that it was like losing a battle even though he technically won. Pyrrhus, after fighting the Romans, he actually comes to Sicily and he fights the Carthaginians, and he beats them, but again, he beats them just barely, much like the Romans. The Carthaginians are very persistent fighters, they're hard to beat. Pyrrhus eventually leaves, and Carthage slowly comes back. Now, if you've got my PDF and you're looking through the images that I've put on there, and you can find the map of Sicily, I think on the 4th slide or the 4th page, you can see that there are battles all over the island. But we need to talk about how Rome and Carthage actually went to war. Because Rome, at the beginning of the conflict, which occurs in 464 BC, or 264 BC, excuse me, 264, Rome is not really involved on Sicily whatsoever. It's not on the island of Sicily. It has no allies or colonies on the island of Sicily. And Carthage actually controls quite a bit of Sicily. So we might wonder, why does Rome get involved? Well, we actually have to talk about a complex situation that was going on. And oftentimes, by the way, world history is like this. A kind of random event will occur, and it will drag these huge nations into battle. It will drag these huge powers into a fight. And we look back and we go, wow, the event that started that all off with was rather silly. And that's exactly what happened here in the Punic War. So what had happened is Rome had allied itself with cities in Italy itself and had conquered them and taken them over. And one of the cities that Rome had allied itself with had troops that it would hire out to other cities. The men of this city would hire themselves as warriors. They're called mercenaries. This is the English word for this. They would fight as mercenaries. So if you had a war to fight or if you had a battle to fight, you would hire these guys for gold. They would come over. They would fight for you. Now, these guys had been hired by a city in Sicily called Messana. And now again, if you have the map up, you'll notice that Messana is on the far eastern side. So if you're looking at the map, the far right side, it's at the northeast tip of Sicily. It's literally just a few miles away from the toe of Italy. In fact, you can see across. If you were standing in Italy, the boot, you could actually look across and you could see Messana on the other side. These mercenaries are hired by Messana. They come over, and rather than fight for the city, they double-cross the city, and they actually take it over. And they name themselves the rulers of this city. And, of course, the people that were in the city run away, and they're not very happy with these guys. They paid them, and rather than do what they were asked to do, they actually took over. Okay, nobody's happy about this. And the people of the city run down to Syracuse, and they ask Syracuse for help against this city. And Syracuse says, okay, we will help you. We will send some troops to drive these guys out. And the mercenaries in the town, who are technically allies of Rome, they send to the city of Rome, and they say, we're now under attack in the city that we effectively stole, and you are our allies. You need to come save us. And Rome, kind of puts its head in its hands a little bit, metaphorically, and it goes, okay, we'll come save you guys. And by doing so, Rome now has entered into Sicily. So they send an army under one of the consuls, and he comes down, and he beats up the people that are trying to retake over the city, the rightful owners of the city, actually. So the Romans kind of show up, and they protect these guys. But in doing so, they now have locked themselves into battle with the Carthaginians. They're now involved in a war with the Carthaginians. Because the Carthaginians, as soon as Rome shows up, they say, Rome, you need to get out of here. We do not want you here. You're too close for comfort. We know what you guys do. We know, Romans, from what we've seen over the last few hundred years, that once you show up somewhere, you conquer everything. So you need to leave. You need to leave the city of Messana. And the Romans say, no, I don't think so. I think we're going to stay. And this is what brings Rome and Carthage into conflict. And you might go, well, that doesn't seem like they even have a reason to fight. They don't. But Carthage is afraid that Rome will eventually conquer the entire island if they stay. That's the concern. And of course, Rome is prideful. right? Carthage, you can't tell us what to do. You can't tell us to leave. Nobody tells Rome what to do. If we want to be here, we're going to be here. And if you want to order us around, we're going to have to knock you around a little bit to show you that nobody does that to Rome. So the two empires are now at war. Now, for Rome, though, Rome's got a problem. In fact, if you were a betting person, if you were a bookie, you were taking bets on the ancient Mediterranean world, you would probably bet on Carthage. And here's why. Number one, Carthage's empire was much bigger. Again, if you've got my PDF up, you can scroll through one of the first maps, and there's a map where Rome's territory is in green and Carthage's territory is in red. Carthage has a lot more territory. Carthage also has an experienced navy. And again, look at the battlefield of the Mediterranean. If you want to get around, you need a navy. The Romans, according to the Romans themselves, didn't even know how to make a warship. Right? They could make a cargo ship, but they couldn't make a ship that could fight. So the Romans are now going to get involved in fighting on an island, something you can only reach by sea, even though they don't know how to make ships. So if you were a betting person, you might think, wow, Carthage is going to win this battle pretty easily, or this war pretty easily, because the Romans don't know what they're doing. Now, the Romans on land are pretty good, but of course you got to get there first to actually fight a battle. So many people thought that, well, the Romans are going to lose this, Carthaginians are going to win, no problems. But two things are going to really mess the Carthaginians up. Number one is they did not realize and they did not predict how fast the Romans were going to move. Because the Romans realized if we can't build warships to fight against Carthage, our best bet is to get an army into Sicily as quickly as possible before the Carthaginians can send ships to stop us. And if we can get that army into Sicily, then it can run around the countryside and it can beat up the Carthaginians, and there's nothing their ships can do about it. And this is exactly what they do. The Romans send armies very quickly into Sicily, and before the Carthaginians can react, they're getting beat up by these Roman armies. Remember, we talked about the Roman legions and how they fought in this checkerboard pattern, right? We talked about the maniples, that's what that's called, in this checkerboard pattern, and the Carthaginians would go out and fight the legions and they would just lose. The Carthaginians hired mercenaries. Remember, we talked about mercenaries are warriors for hire. They hired mercenaries from all over the world, and every group that they hired seemed to lose against the Romans and their legions, okay? So the Romans just won all of these battles. In fact, the Carthaginians were forced to hide inside their cities. It was the only place safe from the Romans. The Romans beat them every time in the battlefield, but the Romans weren't great yet at climbing over walls, right? Climbing over walls is hard. You can't do it quickly. There's opportunities to get shot by bows and arrows, have rocks dropped on you, so on and so forth. So the Carthaginians' only hope of holding the Romans off is to hide in their cities. So that's exactly what they do. They figure, okay, the Roman army is now stuck in Sicily. We control the sea, so the Romans can't send extra food, and we're just going to wait the Romans out. It's like a reverse siege. Yeah, we're locked inside the city, but we have all the food from the countryside. The Romans have no food. They're going to starve. They're going to go home, and we're going to win. And unfortunately for the Carthaginians, they're wrong on this too, because despite the fact that Rome had showed up and had kind of fought with that big Greek city of Syracuse at the very beginning of the war, Syracuse did some math. They thought real quick and real hard, and they were like, who do we not want around more? Do we not want the Romans, who just control really one city right now, or do we not want the Carthaginians, who basically control the rest of Sicily? They decide they don't want the Carthaginians. And so Syracuse, which has its own navy, it has lots of food, says to Rome, we want to make an alliance with you. We'll supply your men with food as long as you don't attack us or our allies. And Rome says, yes, this is a good deal for us. We accept. So now Syracuse and Rome are on the same side. Syracuse begins supplying the Romans with food. So now these Roman armies, which the Carthaginians thought would starve to death, they have food. They won't starve to death, and they can just wait around these Carthaginian cities until they starve. Right? So we have a complete change in situation. Now, the Romans realize that they still have a problem. So these two things go in the Romans' favor. That's good, but the Romans realize they still have a problem. They're not going to win the war long term if they can't build their own navy. Because eventually what Carthage's plan is they're going to hire more and more troops. They're going to recruit every mercenary and every warrior that they can find, and they're going to make this huge relief army, and they're going to land it in Sicily, and they're just going to outnumber the Romans, and they're going to beat them that way. So eventually the Roman army is going to get attacked by an even bigger Carthaginian army, unless the Romans can build their own navy. So the Romans are forced now to create a navy. And apparently, according to the Romans, they get lucky. Because on the coast of Italy, some Roman soldiers are walking down the beach. Maybe they're marching towards Sicily, and they come across a wreck of a Carthaginian ship. It got blown up onto the beach by a storm. And supposedly, the Romans took this ship, and they looked at it, and from looking at the ship, from taking actually the wreck apart, they actually learned how to build their own ships. And for years, we thought there was no way that that was actually true. The Romans already knew how to build ships, but they were just, it's kind of like propaganda, right? Look how smart we were. We figured out how to build a ship that fast because we found a wrecked Carthaginian ship. So we thought that was not true for a long time. But the really interesting thing is, a few years ago, we found a wreck of a Carthaginian ship on the bottom of the ocean. And we brought it up, and it was restored, and something very interesting was found on the ship. Inside the ship, the Carthaginians would actually label the parts of the ship in the order that they needed to be built in. So let me give you an example. You guys will all understand this one. Think about a Lego set, right? If you have a Lego set, if you're a normal person like Mr. Mortar, you use directions. Okay, my wife makes fun of me. She likes to try and do Lego sets without instructions. But then again, her Lego sets never turn out right. So I build Lego sets with instructions, right? And if you go through the instructions on the Lego set, it tells you piece A goes here, and then you put piece B on top of that, and then part C goes on top of that. The Carthaginian boats actually had the exact same thing. In fact, if you could read the Phoenician alphabet, which you probably can because it's not that different from yours, you could look at these pieces of wood and you could say, okay, this is piece A. That went on first. So if I'm going to build my own ship, I need to put that down first. Okay, here's part B. This needs to go on next, so on and so forth. So it's actually entirely possible that the Romans found a ship, they looked at the letters inside of it, and they said, this is how you build a warship. And so the Romans, in about 260 BC, suddenly build their first fleet. So the Carthaginians are thinking that the Romans have no navy. They've never had a navy before. The Romans, in secret, build a navy, and they send it out to fight the Carthaginians. Now the Romans, they're smart, and they think about this, right? They know that they could never hope to be as good of sailors as the Carthaginians. Remember, we talked about this back when we talked about Athens and Sparta. The Athenians had been on the water basically since the time they were born. They were expert sailors. They could sail around the Spartans. They could sail around the Persians. They could ram them with their ships. And these big, heavy, inexperienced ships for the other side just got taken apart. Right? And the Romans know we may have just built our first navy, but we're not expert sailors. We don't really know what we're doing. So we don't want to try and ram our opponents. We don't want to do that. Instead, the Romans want to use their strength. Their strength is those legionary soldiers. If I can get my soldiers onto the enemy's boat, he can chop everybody up with his gladius. He can stab everybody with his sword. And that's how we're going to win. So the Romans invent a new piece of technology, something that had never been seen before. And again, if you have my PDF, you can see what it looks like. It's called the raven's beak, or just the raven. Okay, in Latin, the word for raven is corvus. And so if you can't see it, let me describe it to you. There was a huge pole, think like a telephone pole, mounted on the front of the ship. And on that telephone pole would be a huge rope, and attached to that rope would be a bridge. And you could pull the bridge up like this, and if you release the rope, the bridge would drop like this. And the pole rotated, so you could drop the bridge, 360 degrees around the ship. And so what you would do is you would sail up next to the enemy ship, and you would drop the bridge. And on the end of the bridge is a big spike that sticks down like this. And this is the beak, right? Think about a bird's beak. And it would slam into the top of the enemy ship, and it would stick in the top of the enemy ship, and then your men could run across the bridge. They could jump off on the other side with their swords out and their shields up, and they could kill everybody that they found, and they could capture the ship. And the Carthaginians had never seen anything like this. In fact, nobody had. In fact, we don't even know exactly how the thing worked. Again, I described the basics, and you can even look at pictures of it, but no surviving example of this has ever been found. We've never found a Roman working model of this. So we're not even sure exactly how it works. The Carthaginians had no idea what this was. And so the Romans, when they rode up in the first naval battle that they fought, the Carthaginians were laughing, like, look at these dumb Romans. They're so much slower than we are. They can't even ram us correctly, right? They missed, right? It looks like they were coming to ram us, and they just missed. And then these bridges drop down on their ships, and big Roman soldiers come across with their weapons, and they're ready to go. They're ready to fight, and the Carthaginians don't have any soldiers on their ships, and all of the crew is either killed or captured. And the first naval battle that the Romans fight against these guys, they just beat them. They clobber them. They win, and suddenly the Carthaginians have a problem. Not only is Rome beating them on land, but it just beat them at sea. And if it can beat them at sea, then the Carthaginians have real problems. Now, unfortunately for the Romans get a little bit too confident, right? Have you ever done that? You've succeeded once, and now you're feeling good, right? You're feeling like, okay, I can take on anybody. The Romans are feeling that, and they decide, we're not just going to take over Sicily. We're going to invade Africa, and we're going to take the Carthaginians down in Africa, okay? So the Romans are feeling very confident, and they probably had good reasons too. They'd just beaten the Carthaginians in a naval battle. In fact, they destroyed the Carthaginian fleet. So Carthage had to rebuild its fleet if it was going to stop the Romans, and it couldn't do that very fast. So Rome loads up an entire new army. Rather than send another army to Sicily, they load up a new army on their ships, and they send it to Africa. They unload the army, and they sail back across to Sicily for supplies, and that's when disaster strikes. Because one of the problems with warships, especially warships with these big bridges on the front, is that they don't sail very well. And under normal conditions, not a problem. But if, say, a storm were to happen, where the waves get high and the winds start blowing fast, and these boats are mostly powered by oars, and water starts coming in, the ships can be destroyed. And that's exactly what happens. So Rome has dropped this army off. They're turning around for more supplies, and a storm hits, and 90% of the Roman ships are destroyed. They sink below the waves. And so suddenly, both the Carthaginians and the Romans don't have a navy. Nobody's got a navy. And this Roman army is now stuck in Africa, in enemy territory, with no allies, with no food. It's just got to fight as hard as it can against Carthage. And it does. And the Roman army actually won several battles. Eventually, though, they get tired. They're running out of supplies, and the Romans are forced to surrender to the Carthaginians in Africa, right? They can't win an entire war on their own. They fight as hard as they can, but they just can't do it. They can't be picked up. They can't be rescued. So the Romans decide to surrender. Now this, by the way, is a moment for us to talk about what makes the Romans unique, what makes them special. Because the commander of the Roman invasion is taken by Carthage, and they tell him, you go negotiate on our behalf to the city of Rome. Go talk to him and figure out what it would take to end this war. And so they send him, and the Senate at Rome receives this man, and they say, no, we're not ready to stop fighting. Oh, no, in fact, you can tell the Carthaginians that the only terms that we will accept is conquering all of Sicily. If they leave Sicily, then fine, the war's over. But there's no peace. We're not going to negotiate for half of Sicily. It's all of Sicily or nothing. Right? That's what the Romans say. And the Romans tell this commander, and by the way, you need to go back to Carthage. You're their prisoner. You can't stay here, despite the fact that we're not going to negotiate, right? The Roman Senate says, nope, we're not negotiating. But you, commander, need to go back. And by the way, the Carthaginians had said, look, if you guys won't negotiate, then we're going to kill your leaders. We're gonna kill the leaders of the army we captured, and we're going to sell the rest of the Romans as slaves if you don't negotiate. The Senate says, okay, we won't negotiate. We're going to win this war, and you, commander, need to go back. And the Carthaginians were blown away because the commander sailed back. He sailed back to the city of Carthage, and he said, they won't negotiate. Do with me what you will. Right? And the Carthaginians are like, what do we do with him? Because if it had been a Carthaginian and he'd been sent back by Rome, the Carthaginians would have just kept their commander. They would have said, nope, we're not negotiating. We're not sending you back. We're going to keep you. But the Romans said, no, we're not negotiating. And you made a promise to go back to Carthage. You have to keep the promise, right? And the Roman general says, I made a promise. I have to keep the promise. And he sails back. In fact, our sources tell us that he didn't cry. He didn't care that he was going to be killed. He knew what he was sailing back to. And because he was a good Roman, he went back anyway. Right? So I think this is a good teaching moment of what the Romans were like and why everybody kind of got nervous when the Romans showed up, right? Because those guys, they were like hardcore. They did what they said they were going to do, and they never backed down about it. Now, in the end, the Romans did win the Punic War, although, for the record, it lasted a long time. It lasted almost 2 decades. It lasted almost 20 years. And the war kind of went back and forth. The Romans would seem like they were going to conquer all of Sicily, and then usually a storm would hit and their fleet would get destroyed, and they would have to wait a couple of years while they rebuilt their ships. And Carthage would sneak some food into the cities, and the cities would last longer. Some of these cities were under siege for 10, 15 years before the Romans finally conquered them. But after 20 years of warfare, Rome finally wins. And the main reason that Rome wins is actually because Carthage has started to run out of money. Right? Carthage has to hire its soldiers. It has to pay them large amounts of money to go fight for it, whereas Rome has people fighting for it not because they're being paid, but because they are citizens, and that's their duty. And remember, if the story of that Roman commander teaches us nothing else, Romans do their duty. When the Romans promise to do something, they do it. So these Roman soldiers, year after year, they're back, they're fighting for their country, they don't need any pay, they're fed, that's all they need. That's the difference, right? So the Carthaginians are constantly bleeding money, they're losing money the entire war. The Roman soldiers are willing to fight for as long as it takes for their nation to win. And so eventually, after 20 years of warfare, Carthage gives up. They say, Rome, you can have Sicily if you would like it. That being said, the First Punic War might have been over, but Carthage and Rome were still set on a path to fighting each other because Carthage had lost control of Sicily. In fact, it actually nearly lost control of most of its empire because it actually ran out of money. And the problem with mercenaries is when they're not paid, they decide that they're going to get their money some way or other. And oftentimes the way they decide to get their money is by burning your stuff and stealing it, right? And so this is what the mercenaries do. All over the Carthaginian Empire, the mercenaries that they had hired to fight actually began to take their stuff. And it takes the Carthaginians years to restore their control over what's left of their empire. Spain, North Africa, the islands of Sardinia and Corsica. And actually, Sardinia and Corsica fall to the mercenaries, and Rome sends an army out there and takes the mercenaries out, and then, oh bummer, they take the territory. So Carthage, in just the course of 20, 30 years, has lost 3 of its most important islands. It's lost Sicily, it's lost Corsica, it's lost Sardinia, which are those 2 islands, if you look back at the map of the Mediterranean, they're the islands that are just west of Italy. Carthage has lost all of this land, and they are not happy about it. And so the Carthaginians are going to rebuild their forces. They're going to raise up new generals. They're going to make new friends and allies, and they're going to come back after the Romans, and they're going to try and beat the Romans in a second war. And that's the Second Punic War. And by the way, that's the more famous war. And you may have even heard of the most famous Carthaginian general, because he is famous, and his name is Hannibal, and he's most famous for taking elephants across mountains, although that didn't really matter much. The elephants didn't play much of a role in the battles he fought against Rome, but he is often called Rome's greatest enemy. He came the closest to destroying the Roman Republic when it was still small enough to be destroyed. And if you're curious about him or want to know more about him, you'll have to tune in to our next lecture. All right? So we'll talk about the Second Punic War and Hannibal tomorrow.